You never had enough. Not because you didn't try, because enough was architected never to arrive. There is a pattern that repeats with disconcerting precision throughout the life of almost every contemporary human being. You anticipate something with real intensity. You obtain it. The relief exists. It is genuine. It is not an illusion. But it lasts less than the effort of getting there cost. And before the pleasure of what was achieved can fully settle, there is already something new on the horizon that seems to be what was truly missing, as if the previous thing had been only the antechamber of what actually matters. You change homes. The new home resolves the complaints of the old one, and then it reveals its own complaints, which didn't exist while the old one was obscuring them. You plan a trip for months. The anticipation is almost as pleasurable as the trip itself. You arrive, it's good, but at some point during the trip or shortly after returning, there is already an inner voice mapping the next destination. You acquire an object you desired for a long time. You integrate it into your life. Within weeks, it no longer occupies the same space of attention it occupied as a desire. It has become part of the scenery, invisible. This is not ingratitude. It is not a lack of emotional maturity. It is a mechanism with a name, with a philosophical history, and with modern architects who refined it to the precision of an instrument. And the name of what you are feeling is not dissatisfaction, it is exhaustion. The specific weariness of pursuing indefinitely something that, by design, cannot be reached. There is a form of exhaustion that doesn't show up in any test, that has no identifiable event as its cause. That is not the tiredness of physical effort or the burnout of intense work. It is the weariness of desiring, of keeping lit without rest, an orientation towards something that is always slightly beyond what exists right now. You probably recognize this state not as an episode, but as a background tone, a continuous low-intensity vibration that runs through the days, regardless of what is happening on the surface. You can be fine, objectively fine, with things reasonably in place, and still feel that something is missing. Not something specific you can name clearly. Something, a gap of undefined shape that moves with you regardless of how much you accumulate around it. And the paradox that most people carry without being able to name it is this: the feeling of lack does not diminish in direct proportion to what you acquire. At certain moments, it seems to increase, as if having more sharpens the perception of the gap instead of filling it. This is not neurosis. It is not a personality problem. It is the predictable result of a desire system that was hijacked and recalibrated to function permanently in unsatisfied mode, and that produces, as an inevitable byproduct, a form of exhaustion that has no cure in the next object, the next experience, the next achievement. You are not broken. The system that formats your desire is functioning exactly as it was designed to function. Observe the mechanism in your own movements with clinical attention. You lie down at night with a thought that carries no real urgency, but has persistence, the feeling that the day could have been more, not necessarily more productive, just more intense, more full, closer to something you cannot define with precision, but that you recognize by its absence. You didn't spend the day in suffering, but at the end of it, there is an internal accounting that points to a deficit. You walk into a bookstore, or a museum, or a gourmet market, or any space designed to activate the desire to acquire, and you leave with more than you planned. Not because you were impulsive, because each additional item seemed, at the moment of the decision, to be what was missing for the experience to be complete. And when you get home, the additional items have already lost some of the shine they had on the shelf. But the feeling that something is lacking persists. Identical. You have dear friends, real relationships, genuinely good moments. And yet, on certain nights, there is a specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of the absence of people, but the loneliness of someone who cannot fully inhabit what they have. As if there were a thin pane of glass between you and the experience you are having. You see it. You participate. But you never quite get all the way inside. That glass has a name. Epicurus identified it more than 2,000 years ago with a precision that is unsettling. But before arriving at the diagnosis, observe one more layer of the symptom, the relationship between what you own and how much you actually perceive what you own. Think of the objects you have at home, the objects that cost real effort to acquire, that were desired for some time before they arrived. How many of them do you still notice with any frequency? How many have become part of the background of life, present but invisible? Ataraxia. The tranquility that Epicurus said is the natural state of someone who lives well is not produced by more. It is destroyed by more. And the destruction is silent, gradual, completely imperceptible while it is happening. So why does more produce less? If the pattern is consistent, if the relief generated by each achievement is real but temporary, if desire recalibrates upward with automatic efficiency, if accumulation increases the capacity to perceive the gap instead of filling it, then something in the architecture of contemporary desire is operating against satisfaction, not in favor of it, not by failure, by design. There is a philosopher who lived in ancient Greece in the 4th century before Christ, who spent his life investigating a question that no one else was formulating with that clarity. What is necessary for a human being to feel satisfied? Not happy in the abstract sense. Satisfied in the concrete and verifiable sense that what exists right now is enough, that there is nothing missing that distorts the perception of the present. He was not an ascetic. He did not preach poverty or abstinence. He ate, he drank wine, he had friends, he cultivated pleasure. But he had arrived at a distinction that will completely reorganize what you understand about the void you carry and about who has an interest in that void never closing. Epicurus was born in 341 before Christ on the island of Samos and founded in Athens a philosophical school called simply the Garden, a property where he lived with disciples and friends, growing vegetables, conversing about philosophy, and practicing what he taught. In an era when the Greek philosophical schools competed for prestige and influence in the circles of power, Epicurus chose deliberate retreat, not forced poverty, chosen sufficiency. He was perhaps the most misunderstood philosopher in history. The term Epicurean became synonymous with unbridled hedonism, with surrender to pleasure without limit, the precise opposite of what he taught. What Epicurus taught was a distinction that seems simple and is devastating. Not every satisfied desire produces satisfaction, and understanding why is the only path to comprehending the exhaustion you carry. Epicurus distinguished desires into categories with clinical precision. There are desires that are natural and necessary, the hunger that calls for food, the thirst that calls for water, the cold that calls for shelter, the loneliness that calls for genuine company. These desires, when satisfied, close. There is a natural limit to them. You eat, and the hunger passes. You drink, and the thirst passes. You warm yourself, and the cold passes. The satisfaction is real and complete, because the desire had a defined form and a natural limit. There are desires that are natural but not necessary. The desire for specific flavors instead of any food. The desire for pleasurable company instead of sufficient company. The desire for comfort beyond what is necessary. These desires can be satisfied without great cost, but they can also grow indefinitely if cultivated without discernment. And there is a third category, the one Epicurus considered the source of almost all unnecessary human suffering. Desires that are neither natural nor necessary. Fabricated desires. Desires that would not exist if they had not been implanted by comparison, by social convention, by a system that has an interest in your having them. The desire to possess what others possess. The desire to be recognized in specific ways. The desire to accumulate beyond any real use. The desire for experiences not because they produce genuine pleasure, but because not having them produces the feeling of falling behind. These desires, Epicurus said, have no natural limit. They cannot be definitively satisfied because they were not created by a real need. They were created by a system of comparison and expectation that continuously recalibrates. Satisfying them doesn't extinguish them. It feeds them. You satisfy one and two new ones appear in its place, slightly larger, slightly more demanding, slightly more distant. and contemporary culture, with a sophistication that Epicurus could not have imagined in detail, but that fits precisely into the anatomy of desire he described, is the most efficient machine for fabricating unnatural and unnecessary desires that human history has ever produced. Not because the products and experiences it offers are bad, but because the mechanism by which it presents them, constant comparison, the permanent recalibration of the reference point, the programmed obsolescence of what you have in favor of what you don't yet have, produces exactly the type of desire that Epicurus identified as the source of incurable exhaustion. You are exhausted not because you are pursuing the wrong thing. You are exhausted because you are pursuing what was designed never to be definitively reached. And that design is not accidental. It is the logic of the system. Let's open the mechanism with precision. Epicurus used the concept of katastasis to describe the state of pleasure he considered the highest and most stable, not kinetic pleasure, the pleasure of movement, of conquest, of acquisition, but the pleasure of a state of equilibrium, the absence of physical pain, the absence of mental disturbance, the tranquility that emerges when real needs are satisfied, and desire is not in compulsive motion toward the next object. He called this state ataraxia, the absence of disturbance, and he said it was the natural state of a human being who distinguishes their desires with clarity, not a state of ecstasy or conquest, a state of satisfied stillness, the philosophical equivalent of a stomach that has eaten enough, not overfull, not empty, at the point where food has ceased to be the focus of attention. Now observe what contemporary culture does with this state. Ataraxia, the tranquility of someone who is satisfied with what exists, is economically useless. A person in ataraxia does not buy what they don't need, does not replace what works with what is newer, does not seek the next experience before having fully inhabited the previous one, does not feel the fabricated urgency that the present is insufficient and that something available for purchase would resolve that insufficiency. Ataraxia is the structural enemy of any system that depends on continuous desire to function. And so it was attacked, not frontally, not with prohibition, but with recalibration, with the permanent adjustment of the reference point that makes what you have always slightly inferior to what is available to be obtained. Think about how you perceive the objects you own today compared to how you would perceive them if there were no information whatsoever about what exists beyond them. A book read on a Saturday afternoon with no information about the other 1,000 books that exist and that you haven't yet read carries a different weight of presence than a book read while a stack of others waits on the nightstand and a list of 100 titles sits waiting on a favorites platform. The object hasn't changed. The context in which it exists has changed, and context is what determines how you perceive it. Epicurus understood this with a clarity that hasn't aged. Satisfaction is not a function of what you have. It is a function of the relationship between what you have and what your desire system considers you should have. And when that system is continuously recalibrated upward by an environment of comparison and excess, satisfaction becomes structurally impossible, regardless of how much you accumulate. You are not dissatisfied because you have too little. You are dissatisfied because your reference point was moved to a place that what you have will never reach. And it was moved deliberately, repeatedly, with growing precision. There is a category of desire that functions in the inverse of what would be expected. Instead of diminishing when satisfied, it grows. You obtain what you wanted. The pleasure is real. But before it completes itself, the desire has already identified the next object, slightly larger, slightly more refined, slightly more distant. Epicurus called these desires vain, not because the pleasure they produce is false, but because they have no natural limit. They were not generated by a need with a defined form. They were generated by comparison, by convention, by a system that needs you to keep desiring. Satisfying them is feeding them. And the weariness you call existential exhaustion is the physiological tiredness of an organism that has pursued indefinitely something that, by design, retreats at the same pace at which you advance. Epicurus described ataraxia, the tranquility of someone who is not in compulsive motion toward the next desire, as the highest state of pleasure available to a human being. Not ecstasy, not conquest. Satisfied stillness. The state in which what exists right now is sufficient for attention to rest in it without being pulled toward what doesn't yet exist. This state is what the culture of excess systematically destroys, not through prohibition, through recalibration. Each personalized offer, each comparison with what others have, each presentation of the new before the current has been fully inhabited, these are mechanisms of destroying ataraxia that operate without you noticing that something is being taken. What was stolen from you is not satisfaction. It is the capacity to recognize it when it exists. There is a kind of tiredness that is not physical and has no identifiable event as its cause, that appears not when you have done too much, but when you have desired too much, when the system of orientation toward the next object operated without enough pause for any point of arrival to be inhabited. Epicurus would identify this state with precision. It is the weariness of someone who confused vain desires with real needs and spent their entire life trying to satisfy something that cannot, by nature, be satisfied. Not because you are weak, because the desire was not yours. It was implanted in a system that recalibrates faster than you can keep up with. The existential exhaustion you carry is not a sign that you are near your limit. It is a sign that you pursued for long enough something that was designed to have no arrival. Now the diagnosis deepens to where it truly bothers. Epicurus was not preaching poverty. This is essential for the diagnosis not to become moralism. He ate, he appreciated good wine, he valued friendship and genuine pleasure. What he distinguished was not between having and not having. It was between the type of desire that orients the relationship with what one has. And here is the most disturbing layer of the contemporary diagnosis. The system that produces vain desires on an industrial scale does not operate only at the level of objects. It operates at the level of perception itself. It is not just that it makes you want more things. It actively atrophies your capacity to perceive what already exists as sufficient. Like a muscle that without use loses mass, the capacity to inhabit the present with full attention to what is available right now atrophies when systematically replaced by orientation toward what exists beyond the now. Observe how you eat. Not necessarily what you eat, how you eat. How many meals per week do you fully inhabit? Noticing flavors, textures, the temperature of what is in your mouth, the conversation around the table, the feeling of satiety arriving gradually? And how many meals happen while your attention is divided by something that is not the meal, a piece of reading, an audio, a thought about what comes next? I am not describing distraction as a moral vice. I am describing the operation of a desire system that never allows attention to land completely in the present, because landing completely in the present is the state in which satisfaction becomes perceptible, and perceptible satisfaction is the state in which you stop seeking the next object. Epicurus said that the greatest gift a human being can give themselves is the capacity to feel pleasure in what is simple and immediate, not as resignation to the simple, as an education of perception to perceive what is available right now. A good meal, a conversation without hurry, the quality of the light on a specific afternoon, the weight of a book in the hands. These experiences have the capacity to produce what he called catastatic pleasure, stable, without compulsive motion, without the abrupt decline that follows the kinetic pleasure of conquest. But this capacity for perception is exactly what atrophies when the desire system is constantly recalibrated toward the next. You don't lose the capacity for pleasure. You lose the capacity for pleasure in what is sufficient. And the sufficient begins to seem insufficient not because it changed, but because the reference point moved. And what moves the reference point, with an efficiency that Epicurus could not have imagined in detail, is a system of comparison and presentation of excess that operates continuously, in a personalized and invisible way. Every time what you have is placed alongside what you could have, what you have shrinks, not in the world, in your perception. And shrunken perception is the only place where dissatisfaction exists, because dissatisfaction is not a property of objects, it is a property of the relationship between the object and the reference point from which you look at it. Epicurus lived in the garden with bread, olives, cheese, and water, and wrote that this was the state of abundance that most people never experience, not for lack of objects, but for excess of reference, for carrying a desire system recalibrated upward beyond any possibility of real satisfaction. The dissatisfaction you feel is not a sign that you have too little. It is a sign that your reference point was moved too far for what you have to seem sufficient, and that movement was not made by you. It was made by a system that needs your desire in perpetual motion in order to keep functioning. A satisfied person is a person who has stopped, and a person who has stopped does not feed the system. Epicurus would say, "This is the only truth, that the system around you has a structural interest in your never discovering. We've reached the core, and it is more disturbing than what came before because it is the simplest. You are not empty because something is missing. You are empty because your capacity to perceive what is already full was progressively atrophied by a system that fabricates desire beyond any real need, and that only functions while desire is in motion." The inversion that the Epicurean diagnosis demands is this: the exhaustion you feel is not the cost of not having arrived yet. It is the cost of pursuing indefinitely something that by structural design cannot be definitively reached. The target is not distant because you haven't run fast enough. The target is moving because it needed to be moving for you to keep running. Epicurus named this more than 2,000 years ago with a clarity that hasn't aged. Confusing fabricated desires with real needs is the source of almost all unnecessary human suffering. Not the suffering that comes from real loss, from physical pain, from inescapable finitude, that suffering is part of existence and has no philosophical solution. But the suffering that comes from pursuing what doesn't need to be pursued, from missing what was never necessary, from measuring what exists against the standard of what could exist, that suffering is fabricated, and what is fabricated has fabricators. The chronic dissatisfaction you carry is not a diagnosis of what you are. It is the product functioning exactly as it was designed. You are exhausted not because you failed to arrive. You are exhausted because you were kept in motion by a system that has no interest in your arrival. Now you know the mechanism, and the mechanism has 2,300 years of precise philosophical diagnosis and continues to operate because most people never receive the name of what they are feeling. You are receiving it now. Now the phenomenon is entirely readable. The chronic dissatisfaction you experience is not the consequence of having too little. It is the structural and predictable consequence of inhabiting a system that fabricates desires without a natural limit and presents them as needs, permanently displacing the reference point from which you judge what exists right now. When the reference point is systematically moved beyond what is reachable, what exists right now becomes, by structural definition, insufficient. Not because it is insufficient for real needs, but because it was declared insufficient by the comparison system you have internalized. Epicurus was not describing a rare pathology. He was describing what inevitably happens when a human being confuses fabricated desires with natural needs and directs their vital energy towards satisfying what cannot, by nature, be definitively satisfied. The existential exhaustion that accompanies this state is not a character weakness. It is the physiologically predictable response of an organism that has pursued indefinitely a moving target. You are not tired because you are weak. You are tired because you were kept in motion for longer than any organism can sustain without collapse. And the collapse, when it comes, does not come as clarity. It comes as emptiness, as the feeling that nothing matters, that achievement doesn't satisfy, that the next object will be no different from the ones before. Epicurus would call that emptiness the most honest voice you have ever had about the state of your desire. Not a symptom of disease, the correct diagnosis finally spoken. Look back with this diagnosis active and see what it reorganizes. Every time you obtained something and the pleasure lasted less than you expected, and instead of examining the desire system that produced that expectation, you concluded that you had chosen the wrong object, and directed your search toward the next one. You were obeying the logic of the system, not your own. The problem was not in the object, it was in the category of desire that produced it, and changing objects within the same category of desire changes nothing structurally. Every time what you had was placed alongside what you could have, and what you had shrank in perception without anything objective having changed, you experienced the mechanism that Epicurus identified as the core of unnecessary suffering, the comparison between what exists and what the system presents as possible. That comparison is not natural. It is fabricated, and it is fabricated with growing precision. Every time the exhaustion hit, that specific one, with no identifiable cause, that rest doesn't cure because it is not from physical effort, and you interpreted it as a sign that you needed more instead of as a sign that you had pursued too much. You inverted the diagnosis, and the inversion of the diagnosis is exactly what the system needs to keep operating. Epicurus lived with simplicity not because he couldn't have more, because he had understood that more did not produce more satisfaction. It produced more capacity to perceive what was missing. And the capacity to perceive what is missing is the resource that the desire system fabricates and sells back to you as the problem its products will solve. You buy the solution to a problem that the purchase created, and the cycle is self-sustaining because the system that creates the problem also provides the tools for diagnosis. And those tools always point outward, never at the structure of the system itself. Epicurus pointed inward, toward the distinction between what you genuinely need and what was fabricated for you to feel that you need. That distinction, made honestly, is the only place where exhaustion has any chance of settling, not because it resolves, but because it correctly names what is happening. Epicurus left a question he never formulated explicitly, but that runs through his entire philosophy as an unresolved tension. The question is this: if you were to distinguish clearly, now, with the diagnosis active, which of your desires have a natural limit and which were fabricated by the system of comparison and excess, what would you do with that distinction? Not as a life program, as an honest question about what you would find if you stopped pursuing what was fabricated and examined what truly exists right now, what you have, what you appreciate, what produces pleasure when you are completely present in it, without comparing it to what could exist in its place. But there is a tension that Epicurus did not resolve. The distinction between natural desire and fabricated desire is not always clear. The desire for genuine companionship is natural. The desire for a specific kind of companion in a specific format, with the specific characteristics that the system defined as desirable, at what point is that still natural, and at what point does it begin to be fabricated? The boundary is porous, and trying to identify it with precision is already, in itself, a way of inhabiting the question that Epicurus considered the most important. The question that remains, with no answer I can give you. If excess is the problem, and the diagnosis suggests it is, what do you do with everything you have already accumulated in the hope that it would be the solution? Not what you should do. What you actually perceive now that the mechanism has a name, when you look at what is around you. Epicurus said that a philosophy that does not relieve concrete human suffering is worthless, not as comfort, as an instrument of clarity. Clarity about fabricated desire does not undo the desire, but it changes the relationship with it. And sometimes that change in relationship is the only difference that matters between pursuing indefinitely and realizing that you already arrived long ago, and there was no one there to tell you. Epicurus offers no resolution at the end, and neither will this screenplay, because the diagnosis you moved through cancels nothing. The fabricated desires continue. The system that produces them continues to operate with the same efficiency. The reference point will keep being recalibrated, because the system doesn't stop as long as you are connected to it, and disconnecting completely is not among the realistic options for most people. What changes, the only thing that changes, is that you can no longer call exhaustion a sign that you need more without knowing, deep down, that you are using that interpretation to avoid examining the category of desire that produced it. You can no longer call dissatisfaction motivation without realizing that it may be, precisely, the product functioning as it was designed. Epicurus said, "Natural wealth has limits. The wealth fabricated by vain desire has none." The first step toward inhabiting the former is recognizing that you spent a considerable amount of time pursuing the latter. Antidote doesn't give you Epicurus's ataraxia, it gives you the name of what destroys it. If this diagnosis arrived at the right moment, subscribe to the channel. The next video is already being prepared.